Okay, so this lecture looks at the military orders that evolved after the First Crusade and the conquest of Jerusalem. There are actually quite a few contemporary images, particularly of the Templars, who end up being the more sort of high profile of them, that do give us some insight, at least into sort of how they were perceived in contemporary sources. So the origins of the military orders are associated with just these some sort of pragmatic expectations that arose after the First Crusade. So just this general need to provide concentrated protection for the roads and for pilgrims. But also you have sort of the situation with the papal reform over the course of the 11th century, sort of targeting the laity, trying to sort of change some of their behaviors, particularly in terms of sort of redirecting that violence. And so military monastic order was sort of an ingenious way to take someone whose sort of sole purpose was violence, military training, and give them sort of this pious spiritual vocation. So they really do become these monks because they do take vows of celibacy, poverty, and obedience, just like every other monk. But unlike other members of the church who aren't allowed to wield weapons, it's actually sort of their central purpose. So the Hospitallers, or the Order of St. John of Jerusalem, actually first sort of emerges out of an abbey in Jerusalem, Abbey of St. Mary of the Latins. And this is an abbey that has a long history, but in particular in the 11th century, they were given some additional donations and rebuilt by some Italians who were sort of interested in making sure that people in Jerusalem, particularly pilgrims, had a place to go. Remember, this is pre-inn, this is pre-sort of motel. If you're traveling, you need to find a place to stay. And so usually it was sort of a cathedral or an abbey or a monastery. And so eventually, St. Mary of the Latins becomes not just sort of a place that will temporarily house pilgrims, but also a place that will house sick pilgrims. And a lot of the pilgrims, by the time they reach Jerusalem, just because it's a very arduous sort of journey, are sick and they need some tending. And in part, as the number of pilgrims increase after the conquest of Jerusalem and is perceived as safer to travel, we start to see the need for this increasing. And so in 1113, a sort of a separate foundation is established, and you can see here, so this is in the old part of Jerusalem. So you see the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and then the St. Mary of the Latins on the right, and then the hospital, which is just sort of adjoining that. So the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem then is a mixed monastic community. So it has men and women, monks and nuns, though there is a pretty clear gender division of labor. So the men tend to be responsible for sort of administrative duties. They run the wards. They accept sort of new people. And the women are in charge of the obstetrics ward. There's a separate ward for pregnant women. Also, the women were in charge of the kitchens and in charge of the orphanage. And overall, they sort of vowed to tend to anyone who was sick and then also bury them if they happened to die while they were at the hospital. One of the interesting things, I think, considering the sort of context, is that they were absolutely indiscriminate of who they directed their sort of attentions to. So regardless of nationality, regardless of sex, even regardless of religion. So Muslims and Jews were also welcome at the hospital. They have a very sort of primitive ambulance service where they would actually transport sick people to the hospital, as well as an orphanage. And so they would take in children who had been abandoned or who lost their parents. Physicians and surgeons, there were probably a staff of about 5 to 6 that were formally trained, sort of university trained. And then these were supplemented by a variety of sort of nurses. We know that there were at least 1,000 beds, though when capacity sort of was raised, there were times when they housed as many as 2,000 people. So around the 1120s, and the abbot Raymond of Puy actually produces a rule and adds sort of a military arm to the Hospitallers. And so you can see this is actually an illustration of the Knights Templar, which is the sort of the cross that goes across the shield, and then the Knights Hospitaller has the smaller, sort of eight-pronged cross in the center of his shield. So as they are granted more and more property across Europe, so people who can't go to Jerusalem give them land within Western Europe that then they manage, and so they become an order with more and more resources. And Raymond of Puy then sort of adds this military responsibility, and they adopt sort of protective duties as well. And ultimately, this part of this military arm of the Hospitallers becomes a really important sort of defensive mechanism for the Crusader states, and they're eventually entrusted with 3 of the major fortresses across the Kingdom of Jerusalem. So the second and probably the more famous or infamous military order is the Knights Templar. They actually sort of originate around 1119 when a nobleman from Champagne, Hugh of Pain, and a companion, Godfrey de Saint-Omer, these are both knights. They actually approached the king, Baldwin II, and you can see this is what's illustrated in this image. And they sort of tell him their vision of sort of pledging themselves to the defense of the roads of Jerusalem, in particular to protect the pilgrims. And again, there are about 7 other knights who are interested in sort of adopting this monastic vision that Hugh of Pain and Godfrey of Saint-Omer are sort of presenting. And so what this really does is it marries sort of monastic vows and warfare. So these are all knights, but they have sort of a slightly higher spiritual calling. So again, the same sort of pledge of celibacy, poverty, and obedience, and then they take on this sort of military role. As they evolve, a rule is actually written for them by Bernard of Clairvaux. And Bernard was the very infamous abbot of Clairvaux who plays a really large role in the Second Crusade and who was a really strong advocate for the Knights Templar. This whole idea of sort of a monastic warrior seems sort of incongruous. It seems sort of like it's in contradiction. And Bernard was one of the people who was really able to sell it to the papacy. So they adopted, they wore white robes, much like the Cistercian monks that Bernard of Clairvaux was, with a red cross. They had beards. They had to cut their hair. And the one thing that the rule stipulates that they could not do is wear pointy shoes, because pointy shoes were associated with Muslims. Initially, they were quite impoverished. And so this illustration is a famous one. It has 2 Templars sharing a horse because the sort of original myth probably is that they were so poor they could only afford 1 horse for every 2 men. This is going to change fairly quickly, and we know that by the time this rule is sort of issued, they can have 3 horses per knight, and they can even have a squire. Also in 1129, then, the papacy at the Council of Troyes grants them sort of official monastic recognition, and after that, they're just going to continue to grow. So Hugh of Pain then, after the Council of Troyes in 1129, goes on sort of a recruitment tour of France, and he even goes up into England, in the Low Countries. And as this sort of message is spread, this becomes a really popular sort of group that individuals across Europe want to support. And so the Knights Templar amass a large sort of set of land and holdings across Western Europe. This is one of their castles that they eventually build in medieval Iberia, Spain. So you can get a sense of how much wealth they have at their disposal. They are subject directly to Rome. Unlike a lot of monasteries that are sort of answerable to a bishop, they are not. They have this sort of special status. It gives them a lot of autonomy and independence. They also are excused from paying tithes or the normal taxes that most monasteries pay, which also means that more money sort of stays with them to be used for their various sort of causes. So at the head of the order was an individual named a Grand Master, and Hugh of Pain is the first Grand Master. And then they were divided into 2 different groups based on status. So members of the nobility were called Brother Knights, and sort of members of lesser orders were called Brother Sergeants. One of the primary purposes then of these military orders becomes sort of manning the castles and fortifications that ultimately spread from the north to the south across the Crusader states and are really key to them maintaining control of these territories. So, in part, they are positioned deliberately to control trade routes. They also serve as sort of a fortification where if there is an attack, the local population, the people in the villages and the rural areas can come and seek shelter and at least sort of bodily protection during a siege. They are also there to sort of encourage settlement, so to promise sort of protection for anyone who might be concerned about the stability or the safety of living in these rural areas that can seem very vulnerable. In a lot of instances, they become important administrative centers, so they sort of gather in the tribute from across the countryside. And because the Crusaders, the Latin Christians, are always outnumbered by the local population, a large-scale pitched battle is never in their interest. And so this is one of the ways where they can hold key territories without having to sort of engage in open warfare. So we know that there are 8 new constructions. This kind of gives you an indication over the course of this period of the resources that some of these crusade leaders had at their disposal that then the kings of Jerusalem sort of continued to be able to deploy. Most of them are made of limestone, which is quarried, or sandstone. Some are made of marble. We know that they relied on a huge sort of staff of masons to quarry the stones, but also architects and engineers. These are really formidable structures. In some instances, you might even have sort of engineers coming from Western Europe to help build some of these castles. And in a lot of instances, they were sort of privately funded by various nobles or vassals to the crown. So this is just one example. This is the remnants of Shobak Castle. So you can kind of see how it commands this territory. So it's built in 1115, so not too long after the fall of Jerusalem. And in particular, Shobak is key because it controls the route from Egypt to Damascus. So any sort of communication between the sort of leaders of those two areas would be easily detected. That's also a key trade route. And Shobak is in the Principality of Antioch. So it's up north. Kerak in 1139 was built by King Baldwin II on the remains of what was sort of the remnants of a Roman fortress. It was eventually entrusted to Renaud de Chatillon, who for a while is the Prince of Antioch, but then eventually becomes the Lord of Haute-Jourdain. This is sort of in the southern part of the kingdom, and it was really significant because it really sort of gave them control of that southern border, which was really, really vulnerable. And sort of key trade routes, again, sort of in the southern part would come sort of literally within sort of eyesight of the walls of Kerak. Then there are about 14 castles that were captured from Muslims, and then, so initially subject to Muslim control, and then rebuilt and converted. This one of the most famous, is Crac de Chevalier. So this controlled routes from Antioch to Beirut and then the Mediterranean Ocean. It was built in 1031 by the Emir of Aleppo, who was a really powerful local Muslim lord. And then in 1099, it was initially seized by Raymond of Toulouse before he sort of begins his siege of Tripoli. But he doesn't think he has enough men to hold it. So it sort of reverts to Muslim control until 1110, when it's conquered by Tancred of Galilee, who is regent acting for Bohemond in the Principality of Antioch. And Crac de Chevalier, as you can see, is absolutely an enormous structure. And in 1142, it's granted to the Hospitallers, who have sort of the resources to maintain it and to man the walls. You also have sort of key fortresses along the ports like Sidon. So in 1111, this is captured by Baldwin I. And this is really significant because it controls access to the sea. So any sort of attack from the sea could be avoided, but also it gives them access to any sort of reinforcements or resources that are coming from Italy or from Western Europe. And like a lot of these port cities, there is an Italian quarter with a sizable population of sort of Genoese merchants and merchants from other parts of Italy who settle and then sort of are able to maintain these active ties between Western Europe and the Crusader states in terms not only of trade, but also in terms of providing naval support when needed.